Good morning. It's Monday, January 20th. It's Inauguration Day here in Washington. It's the federal holiday celebrating the life and vision of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's the day after a 42-day ceasefire that's been enacted in Gaza, and it's now 472 days since the multi-front war in the Middle East erupted. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. I'm just back from a week in Israel. What a time to be there. The trip began with a Houthi missile that triggered sirens at 3 a.m. on my first night. And it ended with the news that the ceasefire and hostage for prisoner exchange was indeed set to take place. There was plenty of fascinating meetings and experiences in between. And I've got a lot to say about all of it. But first, a quick note of thanks to my three FDD colleagues who took the wheel while I was overseas. So thank you, Mark Montgomery, Mariam Wahba, and Jonathan Conriquez. And as always, to my colleagues Michael Abney, William Goffberg, and Natalie Ekenau, who keep this program going every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and even on federal holidays. So all of these guys are proof positive that FDD is the best think tank in the business. I think you'll agree. Today's guest is Oded Ailam, the former head of the Mossad's Terrorism Division, with over 2 decades of experience doing things that he can't discuss or he would have to kill us. Oded brings important insight into the war in the Middle East, including the ceasefire agreement and the controversial release of convicted Palestinian terrorists from Israeli prisons. We're going to hear more from Oded in just a few minutes, so hang tight for that. I don't like the deal that freed 3 Israeli women from their nightmare yesterday. Do I feel relief? Of course I do. I can't imagine the hell those women went through. But let's face it, releasing 1,900 jihadi psychos from jail won't end well for anyone. Here's the problem. Lopsided prisoner exchanges are the norm with Israel and Hamas, and that norm must be shattered. After my trip to Israel last week, I actually think this dynamic may end sooner rather than later. Here's why. The first phase of the ceasefire deal is set to last 42 days. We'll see the return of Israel's women, children, injured and ill. Their release will warm the hearts of the Israeli people. Even the ones returned in body bags will bring closure. But then comes phase 2. During that time, Israel is expected to end the conflict permanently in exchange for the release of Israeli men of fighting age held by Hamas. And that's where I think the script gets flipped. I don't think Israel's going to allow the war to end. I think the IDF heads back into Gaza. The government wants to finish off Hamas, so they'll reject a second lopsided trade. Do I think this is a good thing? Maybe. Do I think it will be accepted by all Israelis? No. Will Donald Trump allow it? I have no idea. But I do know this. Hamas is incentivized to take more hostages with the current dynamic. That simply cannot continue. At some point, something has to give. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, a 4th hostage came home over the weekend. Yesterday, the IDF announced that Israeli troops recovered the body of Oron Shaul. Shaul was killed in Gaza during Operation Protective Edge back in 2014. He and 6 other IDF soldiers entered a Gaza City neighborhood in an armored vehicle. Hamas terrorists fired an anti-tank missile at the vehicle, killing all 7 soldiers inside. Hamas then pulled Shaul's body from the scene and has held him captive for a decade. Set aside how depraved that is on the part of Hamas. The IDF vowed to bring everyone home, and it has been working to locate Shaul and to do just that, bring him home. Those efforts culminated on Saturday night when the IDF and Shin Bet launched a covert operation to recover Shaul's body from northern Gaza. Several special forces unit, including the Israeli Navy Shayetet 13 Commando Unit, participated in the operation. I'm glad to see the family get some closure after more than 10 years. Headline 2, the State Department announced a new security assistance package for Lebanon. It's more than $117 million, and it's all for the Lebanese armed forces and international security forces. The State Department rolled out the assistance package after convening a donors meeting with partners and allies to discuss what additional funds are needed to help Lebanese forces implement the ceasefire in southern Lebanon. The package is supposed to help enforce UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which calls on Lebanese forces and UN peacekeepers to ensure that South Lebanon is Hezbollah free. Until now, that mission has been an abject failure. The lack of resources is not the problem. The LAF has consistently turned a blind eye to Hezbollah's entrenchment in southern Lebanon. That's the problem. And for some reason, the US government continues to stuff the LAF's coffers, hoping that someday, somehow, things might change. I know everyone wants to see Lebanon gain the advantage over Hezbollah, but what is the definition of insanity? Right. Headline 3, Russia and Iran signed a comprehensive cooperation agreement on Friday. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian was in Moscow. He and Russian strongman Vladimir Putin signed a 20-year strategic partnership agreement covering everything from defense and technology to energy and trade. The agreement doesn't include mutual defense obligations. In other words, this isn't a NATO-style agreement under which an attack against Iran is an attack against Russia or vice versa. But the treaty does stipulate that if either country is attacked, the other cannot provide support to the adversary, which of course would probably not likely be the case anyway. The treaty will boost trade between Russia and Iran rather significantly. Moscow wants to increase its gas exports to Iran and maybe even build nuclear power plants in the Islamic Republic. Folks, this is all bad news for the West. Iranian officials are touting this agreement as the beginning of a new chapter in Tehran's already close relationship with Moscow. All right, now for that interview with Oded Ailam. As I mentioned earlier, Oded is a Mossad man. He writes a lot of commentary these days for the international media. He's been working a little bit in Hollywood too. But right now, I just wanted to unpack his thoughts on this ceasefire deal. And maybe from there, we can talk a bit about some of those other fronts brewing across the region. So let's do that right now on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome to the program, Oded Ailam.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan.
All right. Well, great to see you. We just caught up in Israel a few days ago, but right now, I just need you to weigh in on this deal. I know there's a lot of disagreement in Israel. I think the divisions are pretty much down the middle, left and right. But bottom line, is this a good thing or a bad thing for Israel in your estimation?
Well, it's a complicated answer, and I will just start to try to describe what actually brought Israel to sign this deal and why, in fact, at that point, it's rather sufficient deal, I would call it. It's not a good deal. It's weighing between bad and worse, but this is a sufficient deal. And the turning point was on the 27th of August. And why it is the turning point? Because if you remember, the objective of the war that were determined by the Israeli government and the Israeli cabinet were two. One is annihilating the Hamas as a military force. Second is to diminish their sovereignty and as a ruling of Gaza. And the third is bringing back all the hostages and, of course, the alive and dead. Those were determined as the three objectives of the war. Now, until 27th of August, Israel believed that we can gain those three objectives altogether because the military pressure that we are putting on the Hamas will bring them to either to the negotiating table or diminishing their capabilities to a point where we can release the hostages by some sort of a military action like Entebbe and so on. What happened on the 27th of August, it was a crucial point because while Israeli forces were advancing in order to release hostages, the Hamas had assassinated them. They killed them and they declared it. They said, listen, if you are going to try to reach hostages by military action, we will kill them. And at that point, the main goals of and the main objectives of the Israeli objective in the war had came to a T-cross. It's either that or either that. We realized that military force will not bring the hostages back alive due to what happened. And we had to choose between two alternatives. The one alternative is eliminating the Hamas and its military force, and the other one is bringing the hostages to their life. They do not go entangled with each other anymore. We cannot drive in a way that we can reach all of those objectives together, and we had to choose. We had to choose between, let's say, realistic approach, or I would say even the what is expected from a country who is fighting for its life, and from the moral stand of bringing the hostages alive. And Israel had chosen the moral stand approach rather than what perhaps any country in the world will choose, is finishing off the Hamas. And when we chose that,
Oded, I want to stop you for a second, because I think what you've just laid out is actually very interesting, because we don't really hear about this date in late August, right? What we typically hear about right now was that this was a Donald Trump tweet that sort of changed everything, that it forced the deal to happen. What you're actually saying is that Israel has actually come to terms with the idea that a swap was necessary because of perhaps a standard operating procedure on the part of Hamas. That's an interesting, I think, new and fresh perspective here. I mean, I think, there are a lot of people in Israel who are saying that maybe the killing of Sinwar was one of the things that forced Hamas to realize they had to make a deal because they didn't want to before that, or even that the ceasefire with Hezbollah, that had forced the issue and maybe led us to this. But I think what you're talking about is a psychological shift that took part on the part of the Israelis, which I think is very interesting. But let me ask you, if I can, just to look ahead for a second. I said just a few minutes ago that I don't think there's going to be a phase two, that I think Israel is going to be quite happy getting out the women, the children, the elderly, the sick, the injured. But then phase two, right, according to the deal, will be that Israel is supposed to release the remaining hostages, which are men of fighting age. In other words, people that are either still active IDF or reserves. And I believe that the Israelis are going to say, no, we're going to keep fighting instead of having them returned in a second hostage deal phase that would guarantee the end of the war. What do you think about that theory?
I want to refer first in very short to what you said regarding the leverage of initiating this deal. What I said was a turning point in the Israeli psychological attitude, but we have to add to that the circumstances, the global circumstances that push the Hamas for that sort of deal. And first of all, is Iran is not a player in the arena anymore. Iran, in fact, you can say even deserted the Hamas. The diminishing of the force of the Hezbollah, which was a very contributing force to the Hamas, and so the Hamas leadership, or what is left of the leadership, stayed actually alone and isolated, and this pushed them for making the extra mile for such a deal, and maybe even diverting some of their, I would say, initial stand of stopping the war completely and have guarantees and so on for Israel. Now, referring to your question, it is a very complicated tango because there are two players in the game. It's us and the Hamas, and of course, it is the American. Take into consideration that the second phase of the deal will actually leave the Hamas with no assets in their hands. And the hostages that they are holding, especially the military one, it's I would call it's sort of a strategic weapon by the Hamas. And so when the Hamas actually return those hostages to Israel, in fact, they have no guarantee that Israel will not continue its attack in order to fulfill the objectives of, and they have actually nothing that can stand between them and Israel. The hostages were their shield, their protection, as I said, because of the 27th of August. So also the Hamas might be deterred or even reluctant to initiate the second phase of the deal. And here we have, ironically, the two sides have no real interest in completing the deal. Of course, Israel wants all the military soldiers back and all the Israeli back in Israel. And I don't think that Netanyahu, and you can blame him for everything. You can blame him for, assassinating Kennedy or whatever. But in a way, I don't think that his perception is continuing an everlasting war. That is not the case. Now, what's going to happen? Let's not forget another thing. The Hamas is not in a full control of Gaza. They suffered some major blow. They have a lot of fraction within the Hamas and, of course, the Jihad Islamic and the clans and so on, that each one of them that are jihadist, fundamentalist, there is the famous surah number 17 in the Quran that calls for annihilating the Jews and so on. So you can count on some sort of anyone within Gaza, and we are talking about 1.8 probably of people, because you don't know the real number, that will initiate some sort of attack that allow Israel to have the pretext to continue the fighting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, although I mean, I guess, the U.S. role here is the other part of this, right? I mean, there is the question of, we've got the inauguration of Donald Trump today, and I think, he wants quiet. And I think, for more than 42 days, I think that is the assessment that I would make. And I do think that there's going to be a question now about whether Trump allows for the return to this. But I think you're right that it's probably not in the interest of either side, and that perhaps 42 days is all we get. I do want to pivot for just a moment. When you and I met in Israel, we talked about Qatar. And the role that it has played in these ceasefire negotiations, but also the role it plays globally in the support of terrorism. If you would, for just a minute, I know we're running out of time here, but just tell us a little bit about how you see the role of Qatar moving forward.
I would say in one word, poisonous.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. Do you think they're going to gain power as a result of this deal, or do they lose power Absolutely. Because they are... I mean, it's sort of like Hamas, right? When Hamas lets go of these hostages, it almost looks like Qatar loses leverage. Is that the case, or do you think they're gaining leverage?
I think Qatar will do its utmost to gain a leverage in this ecosystem that has been created in the Middle East. They are trying to reach Syria. They are trying to reach Lebanon. They're offering huge amount of, I would say, compensation and the rebuilding of Lebanon. And of course, needless to say, they are the first in the line to rebuild Gaza. And I think it is crucial for the West not to allow any sort of involvement of Qatar in the arena. Qatar is a negative and a major influencer. On the negative side, it's a jihadist state. It has a long history of double-crossing and hypocrisy in the way they treat the region, and they want to maintain and even increase their power in the region by the only weapon they know how to use is money.
That is true, and they've got a lot of weapons in that respect.
Oh, yeah.
Last question for you. You're a former Mossad agent. That means you have been taught to think steps ahead, at least theoretically. What do you envision for 2025? What do you think if you're to say, hey, you need to watch these 1 or 2 or 3 files? We only have a minute or two left here, but what are the things that we should be watching for 2025 in the Middle East?
Iran. Iran is the first file that we should be watching. Iran force is deteriorated, and Iran is in a very bad economic crisis. Nevertheless, the regime stands on its feet. They are still hold on the major power in Iran, and they are that close of reaching a nuclear capability. It's just a matter of will and a matter of 2 North Korean scientists that will help them to create the head of the nuclear device, yeah. And that's it. It's a matter of decision. And by saying that, Iran has to be dealt in the 2025. I think it's the major threat, not only to Israel but to the West as a whole. And the deal that you mentioned between or the agreement between Russia and Iran is not a good news for the West.
No, not at all. All right, we're going to leave it there. We're going to continue to watch Iran very closely, as we have been for the last, well, actually decade or so now at FDD, but certainly since the war began. I want to thank you, Oded Ailam, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. FDD adjunct fellow Seth Fransman has a piece in the Jerusalem Post about Houthi attacks against Israel and American and international ships in the Red Sea. Seth tries to assess whether things will slow down, cease, or escalate in light of the Israel-Hamas ceasefire deal. Will the Houthis respect the ceasefire? Will they try not to trigger Donald Trump? Nobody knows, but I suspect we're going to start to get a sense of things this week now that the ceasefire is in effect. My colleague Edmund Fitton-Brown has a new piece in FDD's Long War Journal examining the role of Iraqi Shia militias in Iran's proxy axis. Edmund explores the strategic value these Iraqi proxies bring to Iran and assess the potential for them to trigger a broader regional conflagration involving the United States. On that score, we need to keep a close eye on whether Donald Trump orders the withdrawal of U.S. troops from the Middle East. I can only tell you this. After the collapse of Syria, I am hearing that the Iraqi leadership is not so eager to see American troops depart. And finally, check out a recent episode of the Honestly podcast, that's with Barry Weiss, featuring Lieutenant General retired H.R. McMaster, former National Security Advisor to President Trump and chairman of FDD Center on Military and Political Power. That one's led by Brad Bowman. HR reflected in this podcast on the moments of disagreement that he had with Trump, the foreign policy priorities of the new president, the returning president, Trump's cabinet picks, and more. So check that out. And that's going to do it for this Inauguration Day episode of the FDD Morning Brief. If you're looking for something smart to read, just head to our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD. Check out our Instagram and YouTube channels. And by all means, feel free to make that tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Wednesday for another episode. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.